Welcome everybody who's joining us remotely, and also to all of those of you who are here with us in snowy Geneva. I am sure that you had a very productive time yesterday with all the different sessions. I'm going to briefly introduce session 3 in a moment and hand you over to the moderator. But before I do that, a little bit of housekeeping to say that there's been lots of questions asked about where are the recordings, and the recordings of the sessions will be put on the website by the end of the week. So that's where you'll get the recordings, but of course we do encourage you to attend as many of the sessions as possible. Today, the last session will be at 5 o'clock, and straight afterwards there will be a cocktail reception at 5 o'clock, so there's been a change of time there. But with no further ado, session 3, localizing development cooperation and reaching the furthest behind, obviously leaving no one behind and making the vulnerable visible is one of the objectives of this summit. So I would like to leave you with the very capable moderator, Harpinder Kolakut, Executive Director, Europe of Mercy Corps. Harpinder.
Thank you so much, Claire. And good morning to everybody who's in the room, and also very much a good welcome and a good morning, good afternoon, or good evening if you're online with us today as well. This is a hybrid plenary, so please bear with us as we try to make sure we're as inclusive as possible with our online audience as well as everybody in the room as well. So I've got first of all, let me just quickly introduce myself. My name is Harpinder Kolakut. I am the Executive Director for Mercy Corps in Europe. And Mercy Corps is an organization that provides a lot of implementation in over 40 countries around the world, largely highly fragile contexts that we work in. And we work on conflict and climate-related issues. And today I have the honor of moderating this wonderful panel of our speakers, and we also have a few interventions from the floor as well. We have 90 minutes to make sure we get all of our speakers in, as well as the questions coming in from the floor and from our online community as well. So we're going to be exploring localizing development and how we ensure that no one is left behind. Collectively, we've got 3 aims for this session today. We are going to try to build a shared understanding on the significance of localizing development cooperation specifically, but also looking at what changes are needed from the operational side to really bring localizing development into reality on the ground. And we'll also focus on the importance of delivering on the promise of leaving no one behind. So fundamentally, why are we localizing development? It has to be about delivering on the outcomes at the end of the day. And specifically, we're going to focus on actually how do we ensure that the voices, the needs of those who are most likely to be left behind are included and moved forward at that local level. So we'll be hearing from a diverse group of panelists today to really look at actually how do we make development cooperation much more inclusive, much more operational at that local level, and look at some of the practical changes that we're seeing happen as a result of this agenda by international donors, international agencies, as well as actors working on the ground. I'm hoping we'll have a number of case studies being presented today, so we'll be able to see some of the examples of where practically we are seeing change happen. We will look at some of the methodologies that maybe can be scaled up for different contexts and in different environments. And hopefully we'll also explore some of the barriers that we're facing today. What I'm looking at is for us to, as we work our way through the panel, that we'll see a journey of localizing development. We'll look at where we were in the past and some of the challenges that we encountered, where we are now, and the changes we're implementing, as well as how we get to the future we all envision, specifically to deliver on our commitment to leave no one behind. We've divided this segment of the plenary up into 3 different sections. So we'll have 2 of our speakers speak at the beginning, and then we will open the floor to some contributions from the people in the room as well as those online as well. So please, can I ask, after every time I've come to the conclusion of the first section, the second section, and the third section, if you've got questions in the room, I'd like to invite you to the microphones over there in the corner. So if you could please be there, state your name and organization, and then ask your question or make your contribution for the panel to consider. I will also ask my colleague who's going to be pulling all of the questions coming in from online to then be able to go to the microphone and bring some of the questions in from the community who are joining us online as well. We will try to make sure we bring everybody's comments together, but it is a short 90-minute session, so I will keep us moving as much as we can. My panelists have committed to me that they will speak for 5 minutes, and I will do my best to keep them to that 5 minutes. So hopefully we can stay within time, and I can release you for your much-needed lunch at 1 o'clock as well. But before I get into the discussion for this morning's plenary, let me just firstly introduce our eminent panelists, and then we can get into section 1. I'm going to start from my right, my extreme right, and we're going to work our way around our group of panelists as well. And I've got Miss Chilanda Kluber-Waria, who's the founder and managing director of the Rwanda Advisory Group. They're based in Kenya, but they work across sub-Saharan Africa. So thank you for joining us today. Then next to her, we have Miss Michelle Sumilas, who is the Assistant to the Administrator for Policy, Planning and Learning from the United States Agency for International Development. Welcome, Michelle. And then I have His Excellency, Dr. Rabiu Abudi, Minister for Planning for the Government of Niger. Welcome, Honourable Minister. And just so you're aware, the Minister will be speaking in French in his address and is using the translation device. You should all have them with you. So when we come to that section, please be aware that that address will be in French. And then to my immediate left, I've got Ms. Karin Holshoff, who is the Deputy Executive Director for Partnerships at UNICEF. And then I have Tatiana Frega Diaz, who is the Executive Director for Comunalia from Mexico. And then I have Miss Marie Ottosson, who is the Deputy Director General for the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. Welcome to you all. So let's start off with our first section, and I will be asking Chilanda and Michelle to kick us off first and foremost. We're going to explore what localizing development cooperation practically means from the ground, from a donor perspective, as well as from a civil society and advisory perspective as well. I'm keen to explore with our panel what needs to change to enable national and local organizations to plan and implement their own development. So first I'm going to turn to Chilanda and really ask you to give us an example from your experience of localizing development cooperation. What are the opportunities that we have to support localization, including local governments if you can, and maybe civil society? But also, could you possibly reflect for us a little bit on some of the current barriers that are in place that are holding back progress? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, first and foremost, to the whole team that brought me here and has been keeping me here. And I start first, which could be a good thing or a dangerous thing, we shall know after the proposed 5 minutes. To my esteemed panel, I'm more than honored to share this podium with you. So much to say and so little time, so let me get into it. The question of localizing development cooperation, please allow me to switch that a little bit to actually say, how do we make development cooperation more locally led? Is what I prefer to say, because there's been lots of intentions to localize. There's a number of people on the ground that don't even like to be referred to as local in the first place, so localizing development is not quite getting us there. What we are looking at within this framework is how we build active partnerships with multi-stakeholder actors at local, regional, and global levels even, to enable scale, effectiveness, and sustainability of inclusive development. Now, when we look at it from that perspective, then the past practice is not working. The past practice has been this top-down, onerous processes, often defined and then implemented, driven very much by the donor countries. And we want to switch that to going back to having more locally owned and run systems that are supported by the international, regional, and national resources, where, for example, we tackle the power dynamics that have been at play for a very long time, and instead have a lot more equitable ownership, distribution and control of not just the resources, but also priorities that we set out to do. We want to see a lot of the bilateral and ex-lateral systems reframed and aligned to local and national standards and mechanisms, processes and practices that have been there for long, which means we have to recognize them in that space. And then we want not just any funding, but we want the appropriate funding for us. I think the messages have been coming across, which is more predictable, more substantial relative to the problems that we are trying to sort out, and more importantly, flexible, because as we've had over and over, the issues are complex and ever-changing. We need that flexibility to go where we are needed. And all of that, we're saying we want it within the frameworks of our country national priorities. Bypassing those priorities is one of the things that is causing us problems, because when local actors then switch to what the funders want, we get into trouble with our governments that don't see the value that we are bringing to the table. Why this is important, I was speaking to my daughter, who's Gen Z, typical, early 20s, and she said, "Mama, what are you going to do if you must go?" And I explained to her, and she asked me a very basic question, isn't that the right thing to do? Why are we still talking about it? That's the right thing to do. So, folks, I don't want to give anything major other than it is the right thing to do. It is about time this happened. We have made commitments over and over. We have the development effectiveness principles that we are falling behind, and we need to go back to them to see how we bring them to life and ensure the democratic ownership that we have been aspiring for. If we do want to achieve these SDGs, we need full ownership. And ownership will not happen if we are not even part of the process if it's brought to us. That's a basic, which is why I understand when my daughter says, isn't that the right thing to do? And the last question you asked, which is, what are some of the opportunities and challenges? It's been a very long time of this implementation. We are in 2022. We are still trying to address very complex problems with very finite solutions. We think in 1 year we can achieve a certain number of this, that, and the other to this type of people. The problems we know are infinite and ever-changing. And so that's why we are saying we need to switch this up. Now, in our different contexts, certainly from the work that I've been doing over the years on the continent, we have had a lot of solutions proposed. We have had a lot of local intermediaries coming up, folks that have been built over the years. I was just sharing about how, for example, I've worked within international systems, CSO systems, and I've learned quite a bit. And Waranda Advisory is developed based on the pains, the struggles, the lessons of that journey. And so we have solutions. We have local intermediaries that are not always on the table because the funders are used to their darlings. We've had certain people that we are comfortable working with for too long, and we need to shake ourselves up. We have other creative solutions like the pooled funds, which are making a lot of headway, that are creating the kinds of funding that and relationships that we require to partner effectively with local actors. We have, we've also been told we don't want to give you money because local actors, you cannot scale, you cannot give you small amounts of money, and you cannot absorb huge amounts of money. You only want to offer me one solution when I want a holistic solution. We've been told all of that. But we want to preserve the small and nimble and agile status of the local organizations. And so what they've done is we've had the coming up of local coalitions that have come together that retain and preserve the nature of these entities, self-help groups. We've got multidisciplinary ones as well that incorporate self-help groups like youth groups and women's groups and whatnot. And they also bring in some community-based organizations. They also look into the national NGOs, and so they bring together these different strengths and propose actions. They coalesce around a community, which is what it should be. And therefore going back into community-led solutions versus those that are led by my strategy that was created 5 years ago, because we know anybody who's still implementing their 5-year plan that was developed 5 years ago is sadly needs to update themselves. So we have those solutions that are there that I cannot enumerate in detail in 5 minutes, but anybody interested, we can talk a little bit more. I think I will stop there for now before my passion comes through more intensely than it has been, by saying what really we are pleading for is that we would like to work together with everybody. We want to work, we want you to work with us, not against us. We want to be supported, we don't want to be competed with, and we certainly do not want to be replaced, is what I would say.
That's wonderful. Chilanda, thank you so much for getting us started with such passion and conviction as well. And I really love the way you phrase that. It has to be development cooperation, has to be locally led. I think you're talking very much about the importance of actually starting from the ground upwards and ensuring that international community is then thinking about how does it support that. And I think that nicely takes us to Michelle, if I can, because actually Chilanda's really challenging donors to work differently. And one of her points she made was very clearly what we've done in the past has not worked. It hasn't served us. So, Michelle, could you maybe talk from the United States perspective with regards to actually what you've learned from the past and how that's shaping the direction of travel for the United States as a donor, and how you're going to be changing some of your practices with other donors to ensure that we are much more locally led in our approach, but also that we're ensuring that the communities who are most likely to be left behind are included as well.
Yes, so first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for laying things out, and I may compete with you just in terms of speaking quickly. And for this important session today, I think we know that local ownership is not a new issue within the international community, and in fact, the Global Partnership has been leading on this issue for many, many years. But in the United States, we're looking at it slightly differently, and we're trying to build on the previous efforts by institutionalizing our commitment and doing things differently. So we have been prioritizing this for over 60 years, but we've learned that you can't just do it as kind of counting the number of awards that go to local actors, that you actually have to change the way you think, change the way you act, change the words you use, and as I like to say, you need to show up at the table differently. And we need to put resources into changing ourselves before we ask our partners to change. And so let me work through a couple things that we're doing as we think about how we shift power from Washington, from our mission directors, from our missions to our local partners, and we think differently. So we are thinking about this as a shift towards locally led development. I think localization is a quick kind of buzzword that people are using, but in fact what we're looking for is a process where local actors set their own agendas, they develop the solutions, and they bring the capacity, the leadership, the resources, and the smarts to make these solutions a reality. And we believe that this kind of reliance on our local partners to think about what works in their communities is what will actually get us past where we are right now and allow us to achieve more of the SDGs as we go into 2030. So let me just lay out a few things that we're doing. Last November, USAID's Administrator Samantha Power laid out that we want to change the way we're funding our partners. We're going to be allocating up to 25% of our funding by 2025 through local partners. And that's being defined very carefully and very clearly. But we see local partners need to be elevated within our ecosystem of implementers. And then the second thing that we're going to be working on and measuring, and I just heard that we were already talking together, is that we're going to ensure that local actors and communities lead the design, the implementation, and the evaluation of half of our programs by 2030. We think this is really important because for many years our evaluation has been led by US-based or UK-based partners, and we're not taking into account how those we're working with in countries see our programs. But this is not enough. USAID needs to change ourselves, as I said, and we're looking at a couple different things. What we have learned is that we need to go beyond awards, and we need to change the way we evaluate our staff. We need to change the resources and the types of staff we have in our missions around the world. So for example, over 70% of our staff and country missions around the world are Foreign Service nationals. They are people who live in the country or from the country, maybe from neighboring countries, and we're really relying on them to help us think about how we can set the table in ways that are more inclusive. We're also going to be asking our local partners to help us in project development, project design, implementation, monitoring, and all those kinds of things. We're changing the ways we give grants. We're looking at indirect costs. We're looking at core funding. We're looking at how can we support local organizations in ways that we've supported international NGOs for a very long time. We're also trying to make sure that we're including voices that have not been at the table in all of our conversations. This includes women, girls, youth, LGBTQI communities, indigenous communities, marginalized populations of all different sorts. So what we're also doing is simple things that we've never done before. We're translating our requests for proposals into local languages, into languages other than English. We're changing what you have to submit to be considered for an application. Many of those are 40, 50-page applications. We're asking for 10 pages, maybe 5 pages in some cases, depending on the level of funding. And we're looking at ways of supporting local organizations at the community level for auditing purposes, for HR purposes, other things, so they don't have to turn into international NGOs. But we're going beyond what USAID is doing. We're also working through the Millennium Challenge account and the corporation to make sure that we are working with countries to do large-scale project implementation. This is an agency that was started in 2004, right in the middle of the global partnership work, and we work hand in hand with partner countries to identify the types of interventions that will have lasting poverty impact. The last piece of what we're doing is this is not just an initiative for the United States, and I'm really excited to have joined with Norway today to be releasing a donor statement on locally led development. This statement, which we have and will be sending out to everybody, has 3 main components and commitments. We are talking about shifting and sharing power with local actors, including governments. And I just want to reinforce for everyone that this is not working with local CSOs and universities and private sector in lieu of working with country governments and country partnerships. This is a full picture, and we see this as an expansion of our commitment to the global partnership goals of country ownership. We will be channeling high-quality funding. As I said, we're talking about indirect costs, core funding, directly to our local actors, and we're using our voices to really talk about how to bring locally led development into the forefront. So this is a real collective of important donors. Norway has joined with us, and 13 others have joined with us as well. And we are very excited to then be taking this to the next level. We want to think about how we implement it. What are the things that we as donors need to do differently, and how can we do that across the donor community? So we look forward to working with Sweden as the new co-chair of GPEDC, with OECD DAC partners, with our local governments, our national governments, and with our CSO community to move this all forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was an incredible list of the changes that the USAID as a donor is actually making, and it's tremendous to see the donor statement being released. I think it's being released today, so hopefully you'll be able to see it online on the various different websites. I'm sure we'll be able to share it on Twitter as well. But I would commend the effort of 15 donors signing up to this statement and these 3 specific commitments as well. And I'm particularly interested, as part of this conversation, if we can maybe explore how are we going to be, as the donor community, holding ourselves accountable to this statement as well. But we very much welcome it. And I think we've got an intervention from the floor. If I could see the State Secretary from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway, who is going to, yes, here we go. We've got the State Secretary, Her Excellency Miss Bjorg Sandika, who is going to be able to speak to one of our questions we had for Norway from the floor. So I'm sorry you're not here with us, but I would love to ask you a question with regards to actually how Norway is taking forward locally led development and what you've learned, but also what you can provide as guidance and maybe some lessons from your approaches for other donors as well, which we'd be grateful to hear from. Unfortunately, we've given you 3 minutes for that, so over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for getting us together to talk about this really important topic. And we have been very happy and delighted to work with the US and others on this statement about localization. I've had some questions about what it means, and we see it as a necessary and important shift of decision-making and power to the country level and to the local level. It's in many ways a strengthening and addition to the concept of country ownership that we're very familiar with in this space of development effectiveness. We do need to shift the power, and that also includes us in the development community. We do need, as we heard from our colleague from the US, and we heard from others during these past couple of days, we need high quality funding to be channeled as directly as possible to partners, to the country level, to local organizations, to local partners, to ensure that local capacity building and decision making. For Norway, we provide most of our development assistance through multilateral channels. So on the one hand, we have our bilateral support and our support through civil society, where we believe it is that very important to make sure that we are able to adapt to the local context and to make sure that decisions are made as closely to where the activities that we are helping to fund will be implemented. But it's also important for us when we work through the multilateral system that we are supporting and able to look at how the multilateral agencies come together at the country level and support that country level development. And there are very important and key changes happening within the multilateral system in that regard. Couple of examples that we've learned a lot from. One is we have a program called the Knowledge Bank, or where the capital is knowledge rather than money. And we provide support for statistical development in a number of countries. So our Bureau of Statistics helps build up that capacity to collect data and have the local knowledge about local conditions to enable even better planning. And we believe that's a very important component of what we do, and it shows, and it has proven to us as well, how evidence and localization can be a very effective tool for positive development. So I think I'll just end by saying that for us, locally led development means, again, that local voices are empowered and heard, including bringing those voices back to us. So the local voices are heard in the boardrooms of our multilateral partners and are heard also in our capitals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, State Secretary. That's wonderful. We haven't got very long, but I want to give some time to questions for our first 2 or 3 panelists, actually. I'm sure Norway would be happy to address any questions that are emerging from the floor. If there are any questions we've got one person there. Would you like to come to the mic, if that's okay? And please do state your name and organization, and then your question, and we've got some coming online as well. So let's take the first one, and then we'll come to the ones online.
Thank you very much. My name is MacDonald Munyoro, and I'm from Zimbabwe. So I've just been listening to the panelists speaking, and I've just been reflecting and asking myself a question, because we're trying to talk about localization, but also more importantly, talking about the furthest left behind. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, when I think of the furthest left behind, especially in the context of the Nairobi outcome document, there were specific commitments made around gender equality and women, but also more critically to youth and children. Specifically, the Nairobi outcome document commits to strengthen the capacity and create space for necessary mechanisms for the meaningful engagement of children and youth. In the 2030 agenda, it also commits to promote the productive capacities of youth and expand their economic and social opportunities, and also issues around decent work. So my question to our panelists is how maybe in their work are they also trying to speak to these commitments? Because for me, I believe that moving forward, they can be a game changer. From yesterday, one of the key things that came out was that globally we continue to face more and more problems, and potentially if we are going to ignore the global population of about 2.4 young people it is also going to mean that one day we're going to wake up and it's no longer just the climate crisis, but it might actually be a crisis of exclusion where our young people continue to fall through the cracks. So I think for me, that would be my question. And then also, before I also maybe sit down, it might also be interesting to share that as young people in Africa, based on these commitments, we have also tried to come up with a youth and child indicator in the context of the GPEDC monitoring framework. And I think we are quite, I think, encouraged in the global partnership accepting and taking up some of those elements of that youth indicator. But at the heart of it, really, what we are simply trying to do is to get development cooperation to be inclusive of young people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just capture the online question as well, if I can. And then I'm going to, I'm so sorry, I'm going to just get our two panelists to respond to that. And as we go, if you have more time, we'll keep taking questions as well. So I just want to make sure we stay to time.
So we have a very interesting comment from a representative of IOM, which leads to a very interesting question. There are existing commitments to localization, the OECD DAC recommendation on the humanitarian development peace nexus, for example, that speaks a lot about prioritizing working with local actors. Here is the question. What have we learned from the past that we can use in the future?
Mm-hmm. Great,
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we've got a question around what have we learnt from the past, and obviously there's a lot of commitments that have been made in the past as well, but we're still having this conversation today. So what's going to be different, I think, from that question is what I'm hearing. But also, how do we ensure that we are more inclusive of the voices of children and youth in particular, but also women as well was mentioned there. So Chilanda, could I turn to you first?
Sure, thank you. I can be heard. Those are very critical questions. Thank you for putting them on the table. And I agree, of course, I am extremely biased with what I'm about to say because I am trying to represent the civil society organizations in their complexities, specifically, from around the world. One of the things that I'd like to say is the reason why we see, what my brother was just saying about this exclusion is because for too long we've excluded those who represent those marginalized groups from very pertinent conversations. And not just the conversations, but in the decision-making space. When I started off by refusing to completely embrace the localized terminologies because I don't think it was even coined in the global south that we are trying to do this in. Illustrating my point that all these there's a lot of commitment for multi-stakeholder dialogue, multi-stakeholder platforms. What I want to suggest is to make sure that we put in effort to ensure that we actually have these platforms represent the communities that we want to impact. Now, if a community is diverse, let us take the time and do the homework and do the work to define what that diversity means and not define them in a boardroom, even though we've got people in the boardroom, but those that are in the boardroom have certain privileges. I want to ask that we go beyond. Now, I applaud what USAID, for example, has done with this platform of, they call it What Works, where all sorts of civil society organizations can go on and register to work with USAID, but I bet you my mother's women's group, Luna Women's Group, has absolutely no way of getting in there. I'm not so sure if my mother finally learned how to, I hope she's not watching, to get online to do that. My point is that there are some systems we are putting in place that already immediately marginalize us. We know that young people are there. We know that persons with disability are there. We know that we've got refugees and displaced persons. Can we be represented in every space? Can they be represented in every space? We have the terminology, nothing about us without us. Let us actually put that into practice. What I will say is that let us invest in actually building all these frameworks and structures in the ecosystem that we are working into and allow that diversity to happen. It's the only way we can do that. And do listen. We have marginalized CSOs for too long, and that's why we are where we are at. These folks are on the ground. They are there, they hear it, they represent them, and I think they can represent it really well. And when we talk about working as directly as possible, please ask us, what does direct mean, is what I would say.
That's great, thank you.
So I'll just quickly, I'll just say a couple things. One is, Thank you so much for the question. And I think what we have been doing in our work at USAID over the last 2 years and over the last decades is really focusing on how can we lift up the voices and how can we get the voices of youth, of marginalized populations into our work. And as I said, part of it is just really boring. Part of it is having enough staff who know the country, who can have those conversations. It's knowing who to call. It's knowing not to always call the person that gets called to every boardroom, but calling those other people who are out in the community making a difference. So we are working very carefully. We have also put in requirements in all of our work that we talk to certain communities and countries where we're working, and we will continue to ask all of our staff and our Foreign Service national staff to make sure that they do that. I just want to also just reflect on the question from Ireland about the past commitments. And it is true that many of us have signed up to commitments to work with, to do locally led development in our humanitarian work and our peace building work. But we found in reflecting over the last couple of years that we hadn't done as good of a job in the development community. And I think that's what really galvanized the donor community that signed on to the statement, was to say we need to catch up a little bit to what has been committed to in the Grand Bargain and other places in the development community. And so I just would encourage everybody, we do have copies of the statement and the other countries that are signed on to it. We appreciate all the support, and we are really committed to working with communities and saying, what is it you need? What will make it easier? We have a list of things we think will make it easier, but I think you guys can amend that list, edit it, and redline it so that we get it right.
So one last thing, I promise, I promise, because there are people who will kill me if I don't mention this. I think as we're doing all of that and setting some of these systems, I want to underscore one concept and principle that has been put together by members of CSOs around the globe that is not being taken as seriously as we would like, which is the concept of dynamic accountability. We've had that topic quite a bit being spoken about in the past 1.5 days so far. And dynamic meaning we need that 360 systems for 360 accountability. That I feel like this accountability that we're talking about so far is about CSOs accounting to the donors and CSOs even accounting to their target populations. But I would like to see a little bit more of systems that open up the doors to the donor community so that we can actually know about these things without coming to conferences in these cold countries and things of that nature.
Fair point. Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you. It's been a great way to start us really thinking about some of the challenges that we're facing with regards to actually the systems that we're using. Are the systems fundamentally excluding rather than including? And what does that mean in the changes we need to put in place in practice to actually make sure those voices are heard? And secondly, really thinking about how we're holding ourselves to account, and what does 360 accountability really look like? And again, what needs to change in the way that we think about accountability at the moment to really address this agenda as well? And with that, I think we're going to move into our second section of this panel's discussion today, which really starts to bring in the national level governments and also international agencies. So we're going to hear from the government of Niger and then also from UNICEF with regards to actually how are they reaching and involving those who are most vulnerable in ensuring that we are effectively seeing change at that community level, and what does that mean from a practical perspective as well? So I'm going to turn firstly to the Honourable Minister for Niger to actually take us through the situation from a Niger government perspective, to actually talk us through how the government is supporting the pledge to leave no one behind. I'm really keen to hear about your experience of working with local governments, but also with CSOs at that community level to see how you're achieving progress and how you're monitoring and reporting on your progress on the pledge to leave no one behind as well. So, Minister, over to you. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much. I don't think I would actually need a microphone. I will speak quite loudly, but anyway. First of all, allow me to thank the organisers of this summit for having invited me to participate in this very important session. As a Minister of Planning in the Republic of Niger, this topic, localizing development, cooperation, and reaching the furthest behind, is extremely pertinent, and it shows the importance of localizing development cooperation and the importance of changing the way we operate. And of course, this really is firmly part of what we're doing to leave no one behind. Now, at the moment, I would like to also pay tribute to the other speakers and what they said. And at this point, I would like to tell you about the specific situation in Niger. Our approach is based on a decentralization process, which involves setting up municipal authorities all over the country. We have 8 regions and 266 different municipalities. Strategic decisions in development are taken by local authorities, and these include regional councils and then also municipal councils. We have a general code of local authorities which gives the municipalities the authority to draw up their own development plans, regional development plans, and also municipal development plans. And they do this using a national methodological guide based on a participatory, inclusive, iterative approach. So each different municipality has a common framework which allows them to carry out this process. This means that they can take account of the concerns of all different parts of their local society, including the vulnerable parts of society such as women, young people, persons with disabilities, and farmers, shepherds, and nomads. This is also done in line with national guidelines, which are also drawn up according to a diagnostic process, a bottom-up process. NGOs have proven expertise in this sort of process, and they're also firmly rooted in social and cultural environments where they operate. They also have quite a great deal of operational flexibility. And they are involved in this process. They provide support and advice to local authorities, and they also carry out a monitoring role to make sure that no one is left behind or left out of this process. Our local planning process has involved various different partners, including some of the UN system entities. So we carry out a process of participatory municipal planning. We have also further developed this recently with an integrated participatory approach, and also based on the experience of what we call the social contract. We've also received support from the World Food Programme and also from UNICEF. These are 2 UN system agencies, and I'd like to commend their work at this point. In terms of political commitment, it's important to note that in our general political policy declaration, the Prime Minister demonstrated his intention to not leave anyone behind through theme 7 of this statement. This is entitled National Solidarity and Social and Economic Inclusion. This involves social protection, strengthening mechanisms for social protection, empowerment of women, protecting children, providing youth access to jobs, and also disaster management. And also through the Economic and Social Development Plan that I've recently presented to our technical and financial partners that just last week. So this plan involves Program 12. And Program 12 covers strengthening local governance and planning. Through this plan, the government has set itself an objective of promoting decentralization and local governance, and also responding to the needs for inclusion and accountability when it comes to certain different social categories. Now, this is the institutional process, but we also have a political process of decentralization. Allow me just to give you some specific examples of what we've been doing, which demonstrate our intention to not leave anyone behind. In Niger, we have set up a number of different programs which take account of our specific characteristics. We have many young girls who are behind at school, and that relates to our cultural specific characteristics. We're a majority Muslim country, and many young girls have not been to school. So there are these cultural factors that mean sometimes parents are reluctant to send their girls to school. Our government has therefore set up a boarding school program for young girls, which is one solution to try and allow girls to catch up at school. And we have provided $1 billion of funding for this program, and it covers the 2022 to 2026 period. So why is this what we're focusing on? Well, our overall school enrollment rate is 56%, but girls are 13% behind boys in terms of school enrollment. We also have different demographic issues. We have one of the highest population growth rates in the world, 3.9% per year. We also have a very high birth rate, one of the highest in the world, where women tend to have an average of 6 children. And if you go into rural areas, there are areas where women give birth to an average of 9 children each. So to address these demographic issues, which should not necessarily align with the economic progress, the program aims at enrolling girls in school and helping them to stay in school, providing the conditions that can allow them to do that. So by educating girls, then they won't be able to get married so early because they'll be in a favorable learning environment. And then when they leave school, they'll be well educated. They can be engineers and doctors. So they won't necessarily accept to have 9 children. They'll just reject that idea. So this will help us to resolve our demographic problems and also include girls and women in education. A second example I'd like to tell you about involving leaving no one behind is a program for mobile roaming schools for nomad children. So we have a large population of nomads in our country. And so these nomads move around. They're not in the same place for the whole year. After the rainy season, they move with their animals to try and find a new grazing area. And they move, of course, with the children. Now, to try and make sure that the children do not miss out on school, the government has set up a system where the school actually moves with them when their families search for new grazing areas. So this really demonstrates our intention to not leave anyone behind. Their parents are nomads, and that's the way they function, so we're trying to cater to those needs. So that's one of the specific programs. The third specific program I'd like to mention is a program involving delivery of public services and access to jobs, as well as providing economic opportunities to young people in conflict areas. We had a speaker from Tanzania, I believe, who mentioned the danger of leaving young people behind. And this is something I'd like to highlight. It's very important to tackle this issue. In the Sahel area, there is a great deal of insecurity because of jihadist and terrorist attacks. But what's really happening is that there are professional terrorists that come from elsewhere, but also these people tend to recruit young people from our local communities because, in fact, we've not been able to offer these young people sufficient economic opportunities. So then when someone comes with an offer for them, they find it quite appealing. They're recruited by terrorists. They train them, they indoctrinate them, and then they will come back and attack their own brothers and sisters. So this is one of the dangers of leaving people behind. So to try and tackle this, we've set up a very ambitious program with the support of our partners where we have been delivering public services to these young people, and we've been setting up centers where young people can come together, and when education is difficult, these young people are provided with shelter, and then there are also people coming from other places where they are fleeing insecurity, and we try and set up education centers to cater to those children's needs. So this is all part of our strategy to leave no one behind. So this is what we're doing to try and prevent young people from being susceptible to terrorist recruitment. We're providing them with economic opportunities in partnership with the various different partners and stakeholders. Fourthly, we've also set up a national fund for access to jobs for persons with disabilities. So, often persons with disabilities do get marginalised and left behind. So we've set up a national fund to try and help those people and cater to their specific needs. So I'll stop there since my time is running out. And if anyone has any questions or would like any clarifications, then I'd be delighted to provide them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think you've provided a very comprehensive assessment of some of the challenges faced at the national level, the complexity of working with differing communities with differing needs, but also the incredible efforts that are going on in Niger to localize and take, well, devolve governance actually into the local areas, but also then think of individual initiatives that can really reach some of the most complex communities as well. And you also mentioned UNICEF in your remarks as well. And actually, I'm going to turn over to UNICEF to sort of to come over to Karin now as well and ask about the UNICEF approach, an international agency, a large international agency working very much on leaving no one behind. I'm keen for us to hear a little bit more about some of the approaches that you've taken to ensure that community voice are included in the way that you work, and how you're actually ensuring that you're reaching those furthest behind as well through the work that you're doing. So over to you, Karin.
Thanks a lot, Harpinder. And also thanks a lot, Minister, for mentioning WHO and UNICEF. I know we work hand in glove. So it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. At UNICEF, I think we've long recognized that we first can't do it alone. If we think first about the Millennium Development Goals, now the Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030, the challenges of our times are so vast and so immense that not only do we need to partner, we also need to do things differently, as we heard from USAID and also from you in Kenya. So we are an organization that is present with country programs in 158 countries. At subnational level, we have more than 450 subnational offices. So that shows that the bulk of our staff, 85%, works at very decentralized level. But that's not enough. If we want to have a critical transformation in the systems with whom we work, we need to build the systems or support the system strengthening, as we heard also from our colleague minister in Niger, that it is about the last mile. And if we are serious about putting the most deprived first, then we have to change the way we do business. UNICEF, we do co-chair the Interagency Standing Committee Task Force on Localization, and it is a real concern if we think about humanitarian development and peace nexus. Maybe the humanitarian we've learned a lot, maybe on development we've learned a lot, but what did we learn on peace? And for us, you know, the way, if we want to achieve sustainable change, we need to invest a lot more in peace, and that can basically only be done at local level. If we only put the big decision makers in a room, we may not achieve peace in a decade, 2 decades, or 3 decades. But where people live is not in a room. People, they live in villages, they live remote, and we need to reach them. So therefore, the whole peace component of that nexus becomes very important. And that is linking, as many mentioned already, to basic services provision. And I would like to give 2 examples of where some change is taking place in the way we do business. One is a bridge fund. We managed through the National Committee for UNICEF in the USA since 2011. We have a bridge fund of working capital, depending on the time of the year, between $50 and $100 million. And that is a pre-financing mechanism. So if hell breaks loose somewhere, we need instant and immediate support to local level communities. If we wait sometimes for donor money to come in, 4 to 6 months have passed and nothing has happened. Not that donors don't want to give it earlier, but they also need their approvals and projects and processes and signatures and stamps. So we have a pre-financing mechanism that allows all of us to release immediately funds when they are needed. So this started in 2011. We got a lot of support from that fund through pre-financing to get kids back in school after the earthquake in Haiti. And that helped us to have the confidence to make this bridge fund a revolving fund. So the same money, and it went over and over, more than 10 times over the top already, and being replenished. That same fund is used for bringing kids to school. It's used for winterization, winter coats in Syria, in the refugee camps. So it's used wherever it's needed most. And most recently, we also started using it for pre-financing local production sites. We know that in Sahel and the Horn of Africa, due to the war in Ukraine, climate change, drought, and other things, there is an acute need to have ready-to-use therapeutic food. We don't want anymore to buy it and then ship it in or fly it in, but to use local producers. So what we do is we pre-finance the rough materials for local producers, and we help them to have the working capital to start producing, have it quicker. There's also a green component to it, so we don't need to do the transport anymore from afar. So it becomes all strengthening local economy, local investment, local procurement, and local use of ready-to-use therapeutic food. With the same bridge fund, we also, as a sore point with me, the polio eradication. I think we've been speaking decades about polio eradication, and we never kind of get it to the last mile. So what we are doing with the bridge fund is pre-financing polio vaccines. Over $250 million in pre-financing has taken place. So that makes sure that even in the furthest and most remote areas of Balochistan in Pakistan or in Kandahar in Afghanistan, we have at all times enough polio vaccines available to be used. Another example of how we are doing things differently at local level is a program that is called Generation Unlimited. It has many partners, and many of the partners are in this room as well. It's a program that focuses on young people at the transition moment of learning to earning. And in the past 2 years, we worked in Malawi with a drone and data academy, and that sounds very sophisticated, and in a way it is, and we are quite proud of it, that is using high-tech technology to make sure that essential drugs are delivered in the most remote places. So we train local students and activities, and we incorporate young people very early on in the design phase on how they map the needs, so they understand the needs where for the essential drugs. And these drones, they have mounted a camera, so you can see the impact of drought as vaccines are delivered or essential drugs are delivered. And we train about 1,000 young people who are now able also to work with their own drones and analyze the data that comes from the drones while they're collecting, when they're depositing and delivering essential drugs. Those are also ways for innovative financing for children, as we call it. So we use the adaptation of new technologies in the local context, and then those young people are trained to do it for themselves and also make a living of it. So this is now being expanded to young people across 40 countries already, and we have high hopes that this will be a completely new way of using technology, data analysis, and preparedness for climate change and rapid action. I leave it here.
That's great. Karen,
Thank you.
thank you so much for those incredible examples of some of the amazing work that you're doing. It's fascinating. I think the one thing you mentioned, which is the importance of fast finance, one thing we know for certain, crises are going to happen. And it's one of those definite things that is there. So we need to think about actually how do we ensure that the financing stream is enabled to be able to fastly respond as well in the cases of crisis. So that's fantastic. And obviously the innovative examples you've laid out for us are very, very interesting. Drones and data gathering and using the learning to earning schemes are really interesting. And also how they're expanding, I think, is really incredible. And I would personally like to ask, if I've got time and there aren't others, about actually how can other organisations, particularly local civil society organisations, benefit from what you're learning and also then take up some of that learning and become able to mobilise those changes and change initiatives themselves as well. But I'm going to hold that question if I can, and I'm going to make sure we get some of the thoughts from the floor first as well. So I know there was a hand up previously. I just want to make sure, yes. It's the lady there. Yes, please do come on through and we'll get your question. And I'll just check if there's any other questions online as well. No. Okay, and we've got another question.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Kadi Metson, the Head of Development Cooperation from Estonian Foreign Ministry. It's extremely interesting discussion, and I'm very happy that we are discussing it because we know that we cannot continue as we did previously. I also heard a lot of good examples already, and I really want to commend all the donors and international organizations and UNICEF, our good partner, for all these good initiatives. And Estonia is also happy to join the joint donor statement mentioned by Michelle. My question is, how do we really change the dynamics between the donor and partner? How do we build up the trust? I believe that there is certain points really the trust issue, because the donors are accountable to their parliaments who give and approve the money and budgets, and we want the change to happen quickly. But we also know that in partner countries often, there is lack of capacity. Our partners say that we are lacking, capacity, please help us. So what do you think? Should our actions go in parallel, like building up trust, building up capacity, but also really have the flexibility for financial instruments? Or what's really the way forward? The statements are nice, but how in practice we really take these next concrete steps? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you're posing a big conundrum there that we've been debating for a while, but I'll be interested to hear from our panel. I've got another question, and we'll take that if you want to come. Yes, absolutely. And then we'll go back to the panel as well.
Thank you very much to all distinguished panelists for this very rich exchange. My name is Anna Ricoy. I am speaking on behalf of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. I will make a very short contribution followed by a question. FAO welcomes this discussion on how to shift to local actors as leaders in determining their own future. And this must extend across the humanitarian, development, peace, and climate spheres. Because of its strong local dimension, the agricultural sector provides a solid foundation upon which to support local actors to take the lead in frontline humanitarian response and resilience building. It is time for us to move beyond a perspective of localization as a simply transfer of resources to local groups, and to see it as an enormous and critical opportunities to place communities in the lead, determining their own priorities, the changes required to meet their needs, their desire to preserve, continue, and improve their livelihoods. For decades, FAO has been working with local communities to build their capacities to take leadership of their own future, supporting or setting up farmers' associations, women's groups, and natural resource groups. My question to the panelists is, what are other types of community engagement mechanisms that you could share with us so that we can concretely support these local groups to take the lead across the humanitarian, development, peace and climate spheres. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much for your question. Those two are very big questions, and I think we could probably devote another whole panel to discussing those. And I'm aware I've got about 2 minutes to get people's responses. I just wonder if the Minister or Karen, if either of you want to come in on either of those questions, or I can open it up more widely to the panel. Let me just check with the Minister first.
Merci. Bon, ben, je pense que
Thank you. I'd say that overall, when it comes to community involvement, when the donors or the financial or technical partners come, generally they tend to come with preconceived ideas about which sector they would like to intervene in. Very often, we'll find that all the technical partners are focused on, for example, the same topic or the same region because there hasn't been any prior consultation and there hasn't been an alignment with the government's priorities or with the local partners. And so this kind of technical and financial support is not necessarily effective. I was at the World Bank spring meeting this year, and I presented a program to replace 36 temporary schools with permanent solid structures in Niger. And the answer I got from the World Bank was that they'd done a study that demonstrated that there was no need for classrooms for children to study successfully. And my answer to them was, well, that study is not applicable in my country. In my country, if you leave children outdoors, it's 45 degrees in the shade, it's windy and it's dusty, and children cannot learn. And I said to them that I had come to Washington. I wasn't seeking ideas there. My government already had plenty of those, but that I had come seeking resources. It's just to illustrate to you that very often the partners have their own preconceived ideas that fail to take into account local planning and government level planning. And also the other issue being that there's a lot of intervention concentrated in certain areas, while other areas, sectors and regions are neglected. And that means that the results are just not there. I think what we need is an alignment with priorities that are defined by the beneficiaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Karen, would you like to come in at all on any of those two areas?
Yes, I'm fine to come in, because the first question on local capacity, I think there is local capacity everywhere. Whether you can read or write, you organize yourselves, because the basics of survival, you have to be organized at local level. And so I think local capacity exists everywhere. From the UNICEF perspective, we see 3 transition moments in the life of a child. One is at around the age of 5, that's the readiness for school, readiness for learning. Another transition moment is around the age of 10. Is a child able to have foundational learning? And if we know that 2/3 of the children in the globe, around the globe, cannot write a simple text by the age of 10, then we miss a lot on foundational learning. And around the age of 18, another transition moment, that's from learning to earning. So I think if we invest in local capacity, maybe we start with children and we think deliberately on how we can strengthen these 3 transition moments in the lifetime of a child. And then once older, I think we need to be ready to listen. I think capacity is everywhere. We just not always listen. And that is not only, let's say, international organizations. I also think those in power do not always take the time to listen. And I believe there is a big role, and I would not have guessed that I would have said this maybe 10 or 20 years ago, but for the private sector. We hear little about the private sector, but I think local capacity can also be strengthened if we pre-finance local production, whatever can be done locally. And I believe that is an area where we can do much better. We've seen, for example, all the investments that people did from their own little pocket to have a mobile phone. People had no phone at all, no landline, nothing. They jumped directly to a mobile phone, and now they know much better what are the market prices, where to go to sell their products. So I think that leapfrogging together with the private sector is very important to strengthen local capacity.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think we heard very loud and clear there. We need alignment. We need alignment from the local to the national to the global level. And that's really critical. And sometimes that lack of alignment is making us not be able to communicate and not move the agenda forward as well. So how do we get that alignment is going to be critical. And secondly, I think we have to change our mindsets around what we think about capacity and local capacity as well. So I think that those two messages are very loud and clear. And it also leads us to Tatiana, our third section, which is really about hearing from examples in Mexico, how philanthropy has been working with civil society there to actually achieve that change. Be great to get some examples from you on what we can learn before we move to Sweden in our in our third section and our final section, to actually hear a little bit more about what is Sweden doing as a donor, but also the future of GPEDC on this issue as well. So Tatiana, firstly to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. And yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the role of local philanthropy is in locally led solutions, and specifically community philanthropy, which is a framework of actually having a locally led development and mobilizing resources from the communities for a local development. So I'm going to do this talking about a specific example. Comunalia is the alliance of community foundations in Mexico, and we group 17 community foundations in the country in 16 different states. And what we do as community foundations is we work in a territory and we are a vehicle for generosity. So we are local donors, but we also mobilize other kind of resources locally to make sure that we're finding the local solutions that we need for the well-being of our communities. So this particular example is the Active Communities Fund. It's a recent project that we just finished. It was a 2-year project where we mobilized resources, both private and development dollars, for the community foundations to provide solutions to the COVID pandemic, specifically in the economic and social recovery of their own communities as they understood them themselves. So I'm going to talk about 3 things that I think are relevant to make sure that these solutions are locally led. The first one is that this particular fund was built on a dialogue, and it was built on listening from our international donors, listening to the needs of local institutions like community foundations. So we acted as an intermediary between private and development dollars and the community foundations to make sure that we had a flexible fund that could allow for multiple solutions and not only one type of solution that fits everyone. That would make sense for each and every community that we were serving. We worked with 16 community foundations in this fund. And we mobilized around $700,000 from international donors that in turn were matched by the community foundations. We challenged them to match one-on-one these dollars, and they managed to multiply it almost by 10. Why? And this leads me to the second point. Because community foundations are a vehicle for local generosity. And sometimes when we talk about development and when we talk about donors, we sometimes forget that communities have local philanthropists and communities have local resources. So the second thing that I want to make sure that I stress on is that resources are not only money. We establish horizontal relationships by valuing money as well as we value other resources, time, knowledge, spaces where our activities happen. And that is really relevant when we talk about community philanthropy, because we're talking about how do we make sure that international dollars are catalyzing local resources and are building the capacity that the communities need in order to solve their own issues. So in this particular fund, we managed to make sure that those resources were taken into consideration from the design to the implementation to the evaluation of our fund, and we made sure that was the basis of building a horizontal relationship. And then finally, investing in people, which is super relevant when we talk about community philanthropy. Capacity building is key, and these local philanthropic partners like community foundations, they're not only donors, but they're articulators, they're conveners in their community. So they are key to provide support to build the capacity of local leadership to solve issues. So we made sure that this funding was not only going to the projects, and those projects were as diverse as giving direct aid and food support to families that needed them, to providing capacity building to local small businesses to make sure that they were having a business model that was adaptable to the new conditions and the new economic restrictions that we were having during the pandemic. So we make sure that when we talk about localization, and this has been said before during the panel, we're talking about building local leadership. And we're not talking about a top-down approach, but a bottom-up approach where we're making sure that we recognize the power the communities have to mobilize their own resources, and we make sure that we're supporting that power. So this is what community philanthropy is all about. Investing in people's capacity to mobilize all types of resources, to find their own solutions, which in turn builds trusts, and therefore we can build sustainable solutions. And then finally, when we talk about scaling up, I invite all of us to think about scaling up frameworks and methodologies to do things, and scaling up listening and making sure that we're providing the space for people to bring their own solutions. Because when we talk about scaling up, we talk about using solutions that have worked in different contexts and places, and moving them around the world and making sure that we're doing the same thing. But what I invite us to do is to think about how do we scale up methodologies that allow us to listen to the communities and listen to the needs of people in the ground.
That's great. Thank you so much, Tatiana, for those incredible examples of the success of community-led philanthropy from Mexico as well. I'm going to now turn over to Marie from CEDA. And Marie, if I can firstly ask you to talk a little bit more about the learnings you have from CEDA in particular around promoting leaving no one behind based on national and local priorities, but how you've managed to actually move that agenda forward by acting bilaterally, but also through some of the multilateral institutions that CEDA works through as well.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to highlight also the importance of this session, because it is so important we address the question on how to reach the furthest behind. And I was actually given 2.5 minutes to reply to those answers, so I cannot I can't go into too many details. But having said that, we have a very clear focus at CEDA to identify how we can reach the poorest and the most vulnerable ones at all times. We are doing this by applying a multidimensional poverty analysis, the MDPA as we call it. And just to simplify it, I would like to say that we are always answering 3 different questions in this analysis. Who is poor? in what way are they poor and why are they poor. And this has made a shift in our work to making sure that we can address the poorest and the most vulnerable ones since we started using this analysis a couple of years ago. So I think that is our way of ensuring that we have a strong poverty focus at all times. And then in addition to this, I would also like to say that we are also trying to make sure that in all our contribution, we work with a local partner organization in the Global South. And when we do this, we are always trying to make sure that we are aligning with a local partner, which was also addressed by previous speaker, both on their priorities, but also when it comes to using their system. That is our default way of working. So I think that all of this is also very much in line with the idea that decisions should only be taken with the full participation of those whose lives they will affect. And then the final thing on this question, I would like to highlight also the importance of this new DAC recommendation on civil society, of the enabling civil society that was approved in, I think, June or July last year. I think that is one step also to making sure that civil society will have, make it easier for civil society to both to promote them as local actors in their own right, but also as an independent development actors. So I think that this recommendation is more progressive and more supportive of local civil society, which I think is one very important step forward. And then I would also like to say that I know that my colleagues in Sweden, they are now also working with the DAC community on practice to finalize a common toolkit on funding local civil society in partner countries. And this is also aiming at helping all the DAC members to adhere to the recommendation, to implement the recommendation more effectively. And I think that what we have also learned today and what we have heard is that it is important to continue the discussion, but it's also important to have an open mind and to learn and fully understand what has worked and what has not worked in order to achieve sustainable results.
Thank you so much, Marie. Can I ask you to shift your hat a little, if I may, and go into the co-chair hat of GPEDC that you are taking on as of the end of tomorrow? And just maybe give us a couple of thoughts from your perspective on actually what's the role that GPEDC can play around promoting that space for dialogue, but also accountability. Accountability has come up over and over again. How do we think about the way that we change our accountability mechanisms, and what's the role for GPEDC in that area as well? Thank you.
Thank you. And as you said very correctly, we are still the incoming chair, so the first task, of course, will be to speak to our constituency and to the other co-chairs to see how to move forward. But having said that, I would like to say that Sweden is extremely excited that we have taken over this new role. We are also very impressed by the work done by Switzerland, and one thing that they have done is that they have we now have established a new monitoring mechanism at the country level, and that is of course something that we will continue to push for. And I think that the GDDP as such is very important and more important than ever, and one of the basic principles has always been the one has always been ownership. Yeah. And now what we are talking about today is very much the local ownership, which is also, I think, a fundamental principle, and it is obvious nowadays that it is more than the government. So as an incoming chair, I am hoping and I believe that we will also push for an inclusive partnership at the country level. And at the local level, I'm thinking very much, that we need to have everyone around the table there. And this partnership has to include, of course, the national government, but also civil society, private sector, the trade unions, as well as, of course, the international community. So to work for a broad partnership at the country level, that will very clearly be one of our priorities. And I do believe that in itself will also strengthen both the accountability and the transparency in our efforts to making sure that no one is left behind. And just to say a few words about this new delivery model, I think it is important to acknowledge that this is a new model and it is a new way of working. And I think that it is also clear that we all have to do better if we want to have the sustainable results that we are all aiming for. But this new model also includes the reform monitoring exercises. And I think that that one will actually contribute very positively also to a locally led development. And I know I said that, but just to have all the relevant actors sitting around the same table, sharing the same information and knowledge, and all of us will be evaluated and monitored. I think that in itself is a strength, which was also increase both transparency and accountability. And I would also emphasize the importance, once again, of learning, because it is a new model. So I think we have to be a little bit humble and see, okay, how is it working? Do we have maybe one good example in one country that can serve as a role model and learn from them? And even if it is not working, we can learn from that country example. But I do believe that the process itself is very important. I believe that it has a huge potential for increasing the trust among all the actors that are present at the country level. So that will lead to better cooperation, better results. So I think with that I will end, and I am so much looking forward to working with all of you in the next coming years. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And sorry for putting you on the spot as you're going into this process. But I think, you know, it's fundamentally critical. How does the monitoring process actually work and achieve change at that country level? And I think that's very exciting for us to hear today. So we'll be looking forward to seeing how we take that forward. As a community, we all have responsibility for making this work, and I think that's a really important call for us all to engage in the monitoring process more effectively, particularly from the country level, and see how we can ensure that this is inclusive and we have all of the voices at the table. So thank you so much for that. I'm just checking around the room. I know we don't have any questions online, but I'm going to quickly just check if we've got time for one question. Yes, the gentleman over there. Oh, and we've got another hand, and a lady, I think, over there. If you both want to come to the mic and we can capture your questions and see if we can get to those in the next 5 minutes. If you would like to come up as well, thank you. Just wait for you to come through to I think the mics are at this end, so if you just come over here. I think this process allows everyone to get a bit of exercise around the room as they move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've burned some calories now, so I'm ready for lunch. I really appreciate that. Also, of course, the opportunity to speak. Thanks so much for this excellent panel. My name is David Fisher, and I work with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. We're sort of the global club of the world's national societies. They work at the community level through their volunteers. They're known for kind of emergency response, the sort of, the buckets and blankets brigade around the world. But in fact, they do a tremendous amount of work, in peacetime as well, around public health, around social cohesion, around resilience. And one thing that we have learned is that while they have access to humanitarian funds from the international community, development funding, climate funding, peace funding is basically inaccessible to them. And I've had the great privilege in my role to connect with the Grand Bargain, which has been referred to by the panel today, in the localization workstream. And we've been meeting with CSOs across the world, and basically they have a lot of the same experience. Despite the fact that, like our members, they are double, triple, sometimes quadruple-hatted. They don't just work in one sector. But part of the framing of our overall event at this conference, which is fantastic, and partially an answer, I think, to maybe the third of Sita's questions, why are people poor? Well, one reason they're poor is because they are just not prepared for these massive shocks, like COVID, like food security crisis, and like conflicts and disasters around the world. And we are struggling to really make good on what we call the nexus in the resilience space. The funding for this is not there. And we have been asking very insistently with humanitarian donors to stretch that humanitarian money as far as they can. But we are reaching a limit for this. I mean, if you look at the UN's plan for next year, they're estimating that over 330 million people will desperately need humanitarian assistance. And of those, they're only going to target 230 million, and they're not even going to get anywhere near enough funding to do that. So we need to be spending on community level resilience and preparedness. And there is a limited amount of money in all of these fields, but my question, I guess, to the panel is, how can we bring this together? How can we work more intelligently with the various types of international categories we have, particularly to invest in community level organizations, CSOs, branches of Red Cross, other organizations at that level, so that they can be supported not only for, once the dike is broken, but also for their peacetime activities, and particularly for preparedness to withstand the shocks, because they are, in our case anyway, they are working with communities, they are the ones who are doing it, but right now they only have a hope of funding once it's basically too late and the funding has happened.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you. And the lady that was just there. We'll try to capture this quickly, but just to say on that question, the panel after lunch is actually about financing. So I think we can make sure maybe you can bring your question back into that panel, because it will specifically look at that area as well.
So thank you to the panel. Excellent observations. 2 points. Firstly, thanks, Julande, for taking proximate leader perspectives to the floor. My question is to USAID, Sweden, and everyone. Y'all keep talking about working with proximate leaders, and talking of localization, I think Julande's talked about the terminology. Please stop using it. Let's look at ecosystem development. We as proximate leaders have come up with very clear solutions. We've put them to USAID, we've taken them, but they've not been picked up. So my question to the panel is, how do we as proximate leaders who've come together through Catalyst 2030, we've got our facts together, actually get you all to listen to the observations that we have and the suggestions which are coming from the community, from the people working in the community, and are being taken to you, but they are not being picked up. So that's my question, because otherwise it's not going to happen.
That's wonderful. Can I just ask you to state your name and organization?
Sorry, my name is Juru Bilamoria, and I represent Catalyst 2030, which is a network of social innovators from across the world. We are 1,500 of us, many of them very award-winning social entrepreneurs.
Brilliant.
Chilande is a member too. So.
Brilliant. No, it's wonderful. And I think it's a great way to end this panel with that challenging question. So I'm going to just check if, Michelle, would you like to come in on this? And then Marie, would you like to come in on this as well?
Let's see. Maybe I can answer it and Marie will agree. So I just
want to work with you guys as effectively as possible. So it's more a request and a shout out for effectively partnering.
Great, thank you.
So maybe I can just very quickly say, one, it's not challenging to ask that question. That's exactly the kind of question you should be asking. And two, that's exactly why we have worked with donors across, all the donors, across to say, how can we all learn from our NGO partners, from our CSO partners, what is needed, and how can we all then take steps together? Because there are questions of risk. There are questions of capacity and strengthening and all those things. And I think what we're trying to demonstrate in this session is that donors have come together and said, it's time that we all learn together. We'll be working with the DAC. We'll be working with the CSO track that Marie mentioned. We'll be working with other people to share lessons learned, and listening to you, and I will just say your colleague on the panel was talking to my colleagues back in Washington yesterday, will really lead the way for how we can change the way we do business. And we're prepared to do that, and I think other donors are as well.
Super. So then hopefully this can be a partnership where proximate leaders are on an equal basis with donors, because I think that's the power difference we need to change.
That's
Sorry,
wonderful.
I'm being a bit blunt.
No, that's great. That's fantastic, and it's good to hear. So thank you so much for your question. With that, I'm going to bring our panel discussion to a close, because I think it's a great way to wrap this up, because it seems like, from what we're hearing today, particularly from our donor panelists, is that there is a real opening and a real appetite for change here, and there is an invitation to get people round the table. Communities, the donors in particular, are listening. They want to hear. They have made this commitment through the statement that has been issued by 15 donors. that is coming out today to say we want to work differently. And I think this is a real opportunity for us to all come together as around the table. And you know, there were a few themes I wanted to pick up on as we went through the discussion today. That sort of changing the traditional power dynamics. That's a real must here. And so that equality across who is at the table and the voices seems to be really significant, that we are all equal and getting that balance right. Therefore, that alignment is going to be really, really fundamental for change. Secondly, how do we transition away from being direct implementers to genuinely supporting and learning from local partners? That requires a different mindset and a different approach, and it will take time for us to get there, but it's essential that we tip the balance in the other way. And then the third area that I picked up is really about co-creating, learning from what has not worked, rather than just focusing on what works, but learning from what has not worked, making sure we do things differently. And as part of that, there is this constant discussion around predictable, flexible, sustainable financing that needs to be easily accessible. That's always a major challenge from the perspective of communities, is that a lot of the time the funding is relatively inaccessible and they need intermediaries to support them to access that funding. So those are the things that I've picked up, and there's a lot more that I could say in summarizing, but I would like to just thank you, say a big thank you to our panel and our audience for the questions we've had today as well. So thank you so much. Thank you. And I wish you all a good lunch.
Yeah.
Sessions. Thank you.